present our regional president, Harriet Whiting, who will be making introductory welcoming remarks, followed by her State of the Region report. Harriet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. Well, good afternoon and Tagshemir and welcome. We are delighted that so many AJC leaders, community members, and friends have joined us for our 2021 AJC Dallas annual board meeting. This is a special year as it marks 75 years since the founding of our regional office. I could not be prouder to be standing on the shoulders of so many giants who provided leadership to advance AJC's important work in our North Texas and Oklahoma communities. Later in the meeting, we will install an amazing group of new board members who I know will leave their mark on the work and play an important role in combating anti-Semitism, promoting pluralism and democratic values, and securing Israel's rightful place in the community of nations. Their names will be posted in the chat. I look forward to working with each of you. We plan to keep the business portion of our program short so that we can maximize our time with Ambassador Sievers, the founding director of AJC Abu Dhabi, the Sidney Lerner Center for Arab-Jewish Understanding. Our plan is to conclude at 1:15. Just over a year ago, when I started my term as president, we were adapting to these unique pandemic conditions. Drawing inspiration from AJC's National Advocacy Anywhere initiative, we continued to provide programming that was timely, advanced AJC's ambitious agenda, and provided engaging content for our local communities. These are all available on the AJC Dallas YouTube site. A link will be provided in a follow-up email. One of the first advocacy programs featured a conversation on the City of Dallas's response to COVID between City Council member Cara Mendelson, City of Dallas Director of Communications, Outreach and Marketing, Catherine Kayar, and AJC's Dallas Regional Director, Joel Schweitzer. I'm proud to say both panelists have long-standing AJC ties. Among other things, Cara has spoken to our high school LIFT participants, Leaders for Tomorrow, and Catherine was a founding member of our Jewish Latino Alliance. In the moment of our national reckoning, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, our community of conscience, under the leadership of co-chairs Stephanie Schneider, Tina Wasserman, State Representative Carl Sherman, and Bayon Fati, and Juan Carlos Serda, put together a 5-part series on racism and white supremacy. The wide-ranging array of speakers included Congressman Mark Vesey and Eddie Bernice Johnson, City Council member Casey Thomas, Director of the UTA Center for African American Studies, Jason Shelton, and UNT Dallas President Bob Mung, among other luminaries. This series was nationally recognized during the AJC Annual Programming Awards. Our coalition did not stop with the community of conscience through the work of the Jewish, Latino, and Muslim Jewish Advisory Council may have looked different over the last year. The kind of intergroup and interreligious bridge building AJC engages in did not suffer. We held numerous meetings and programs, including our beloved JLA Hanukkah Los Positas celebration and Muslim Jewish Advisory Council affairs. Programs to educate about the Israeli elections provided AJC with opportunities to partner with our friends at SMU, Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs, and our colleagues at Project Interchange. A pre-election discussion featured AJC Jerusalem's director, Avital Leibovitz, and post-election analysis was provided by Jerusalem Post columnist Herb Kenyon. Our legislative and diplomatic work continued over the past year. Our annual diplomatic marathon went viral and concluded in discussions with diplomats from Israel, Mexico, Canada, Poland, and about a dozen others. AJC leaders met with congressional candidates, sitting legislators, and for the second cycle in a row, partnered with Temple Shalom for a debate between candidates for District 32, this time between Colin Allred and Genevieve Collins. Our advocacy made a difference on a statewide level as we shepherded through the creation of a Texas Advisory Commission on the Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism, which will be guided by the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in the state of Texas when determining whether something is anti-Semitic. I was proud to be at the signing with a delegation of AJC volunteer and professional leadership, as I was when Governor Abbott announced his intention to do so at the AJC Dallas and Houston Joint Board Retreat in January of 2020. Finally, I am proud of the work that our regional officers provided to our neighbors to the north, as we have met with legislators from Oklahoma City and Tulsa, as well as the office of Senator Langford. Our office also partnered with UTD Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies to bring a series of anti-Semitism to the Tulsa community. Under the leadership of Charlotte Schumann, we are working with the Oklahoma Jewish community and state legislators to add mandatory Holocaust education to the state educational curriculum. I have to recognize Charlotte Schumann, our stellar Tulsa-based board member, whose passion for AJC, as well as Holocaust education, has opened doors and made a tremendous impact on our work in Tulsa. We would not have so many accomplishments to proudly look back on if we did not have a diverse, passionate, and engaged board. If we were in person, I would ask you to each stand and be recognized. Instead, we are listing your names in the chat here. But please know how much of a difference each of you make to all we accomplish. Stuart, I'm excited and look forward to work with you as our president-elect over the next 2 years. Thank you. I would also like to recognize the hard work of our nomination committee. I deeply thank AJC Dallas staff, Regional Director Joel Schweitzer and Assistant Director Amy Berger, who work tirelessly to ensure our success. We are so fortunate to have the stellar member of our national AJC team right here in Dallas. Kim Kamen provides great perspective, guidance, and for me an entree to have an impact on AJC beyond our regional office. It is now my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Mike Sims, our board member, to introduce our esteemed speaker, as well as Ray Termini, Co-VP of International Affairs, who will be in conversation with Ambassador Sievers. Thank you.
Harriet, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Those of us here in Dallas know Ray Termini is a member of the Dallas AJC Executive Committee and is a co-vice president of the International Affairs Committee. But what you may not know is that Ray practiced law for more than 44 years, both here in the US and in the Arabian Gulf region. In fact, for 15 years prior to his retirement, Ray was a partner at Patton Boggs LLP. He opened the firm's project office in Dubai back in 2007 and lived and practiced real estate law in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar until mid-2010. Ray's written 4 articles on the real estate laws of the UAE, which were published in the US and the Dubai Real Times. And remarkably, he also practiced law in Kuwait for 2 years following its liberation back in 1991. In November of 2013, you should know that Ray was a member of the AJC mission delegation to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Oman, and Bahrain, and has also additionally participated in AJC diplomatic missions in Eastern Europe and Central America. And now to turn to our very special guest this afternoon. As you heard from Harriet, we are deeply honored today to welcome Ambassador Marc J. Sievers, who on June 7th of just this year assumed the position as founding director of AJC Abu Dhabi, the Sidney Lerner Center for Arab Jewish Understanding. Ambassador Sievers, who is no stranger to challenge and to complexity, brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this new role. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman from January 2016 to November of 2019, Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in Cairo from September 2011 through August of 2014, and as Political Minister and Counselor in Baghdad from August 2010 to August 2011. Ambassador Sievers' perspective is also informed by a wide range of posts from abroad, including Counselor for Political Affairs in Tel Aviv from 2006 to 2010, Deputy Chief of Mission in Algiers from 2003 to 2006, and political and council roles in Rabat, Ankara, Riyadh in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Additionally, he was seconded to the Department of Defense in 2004 as a senior advisor to Iraq's Transitional Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a part of the Coalition Provisional Authority. Now here at home, Ambassador Sievers earned his BA from the University of Utah and then a Master's of International Affairs from the other coast, Columbia University in 1980. At the State Department, he served in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and these roles earned numerous awards, including the State Department's Superior Honor and Meritorious Honor Awards, the Intelligence Community's Agency Shield and Exceptional Collector Awards, and the American Foreign Service Association's Sinclair Language Award for his study of Arabic. We are deeply honored and incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to hear and to learn from Ambassador Marc J. Sievers. Ray, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mike, for your kind introduction. We welcome our audience to submit their questions during my conversation with Ambassador Sievers, but please recognize that we will not be able to take all of them, and we will do our best to do so. Good evening, Marc.
Good evening, Ray. Sorry, I had to unmute myself for a second, but yeah, great to be here.
Great.
Oh, Ray,
You're muted now.
So while Ray is working on that, I'll fill in while we get him unmuted. AJC has more than 30 offices worldwide, including 13 overseas, plus partnerships with 37 international Jewish organizations. Our office in Abu Dhabi, which as Mike and Harriet both said, is known as the Sidney Lerner Center for Arab Jewish Understanding, will be the first in an Arab country. It represents the culmination of the successes of AJC's diplomatic visits to the Middle East, which began in 1994. The purpose of AJC's diplomatic work is to develop mutual understanding build common interests, and create channels for effectively discussing regional challenges and conflicts. This work includes holding private meetings with heads of state and foreign ministers and with leaders in political, economic, educational, and scientific fields, as well as hosting and attending public discussions. AJC's diplomatic work also includes mission trips to the Arabian Gulf region, where delegations of AJC leaders and members meet with foreign ministers and other important governmental officials of the Gulf countries. Ray was, as Mike indicated, part of the AJC delegation in November that was led by Jason Isaacson, AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. And at that time, meetings focused in particular on relations of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries with Iran and their concerns on why any agreement, on what any agreement with Iran should entail. So to take from Ray's questions, Mark, let's start, really focusing on the office. Can you comment on the nature of AJC's longstanding work in the region that laid the groundwork for the opening of the Sidney Lerner Center following the historic signing of the Abraham Accords? And how would you characterize the impact of AJC's over 2 decades of engagement in the region?
Sure, Joel. Look, AJC has been a presence in the Gulf and in other critical parts of the Arab world, including Egypt and Jordan, for decades, as you pointed out. And really, there's no substitute for that kind of personal relationship building that has been pursued by AJC for these many years. And I believe that what we saw a year ago in the signing of the Abraham Accords is a culmination of multiple different tracks that include the efforts of AJC to reach out to the leadership of the Gulf, and certainly of the 2 current partners in the Abraham Accords here, the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain. So all of these things are tremendously important. I had just retired as ambassador. Oh, Raymond, Ray, you're unmuted, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Fabulous. Glad you could. But let me just finish this thought that this effort over many years and by many different key leaders of AJC is what has established the trust and confidence on the part of the local leadership, and particularly here, where they were quite willing in a country that has very little in the way of foreign non-governmental organizations, that AJC is now established, and our office is actually open for the most part. And I can get into more detail shortly, but I want to hear from Ray.
Okay. Mark, what experiences did you have in the diplomatic posts that you've had and your interactions with AJC over the years that led you to assume this really trailblazing and amazing role as the first director of AJC's office?
Sure. So I'll let you all in on a little secret. As a graduate student at Columbia University, my first or second semester there in the School of International Affairs, I interned with AJC New York, working in the Middle East office with the legendary George Gruen. So my connections to AJC precede my work as an American diplomat. But over the course of my career, I've met with many AJC delegations, and pretty much everywhere I've been posted when there was an opportunity. When I heard that there was a delegation coming, I tried to make sure that I had a chance to meet them and engage with them. And this last group, of course, before the coronavirus really shut down international travel. So that was at, I think, early December 2019. I had just retired in Muscat as ambassador, and we had a lovely dinner on the beach at the Chetty Hotel with my wife and I and members of that delegation. So I remember that very fondly. So I think when I heard from Jason Isaacson that the Emiratis had agreed to open this office, or to let AJC open the office, I reached out to Jason and I said, who do you have in mind to head it? And he didn't answer me. And I sort of thought, oh, well, that's interesting. And then some weeks later, he approached me and he said, we're looking for someone to head this office. Would you be interested? So I had to consult with my wife and so forth, but pretty soon I came back and said, yeah, I would. So that's how we got here.
Well, we're very fortunate that you did that. Could you sort of explain to us what are your goals for the Abu Dhabi office and the areas that you seek to make your priorities?
So there are a number of goals. I mean, the kind of the key point is to support the expansion and the deepening of the Abraham Accords in every way that we can. I just had a Zoom conference with the Emirati Minister of Youth this afternoon, and she said, look, we don't, the Israeli Emirati business connections are booming. We don't need your help with that. That's taking off all on its own. But we really could use your help with promoting more people-to-people contacts, exchanges, and reaching out to youth. And I'm hoping to hire a deputy, somebody a good deal younger than me, to do sort of that youth program part of our mandate. But also, I'm looking forward to engaging certainly the leadership here in the United Arab Emirates, both in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, and in some of the other Emirates that don't get so much attention to as opportunities present themselves. The Emiratis are very excited that the Expo 2020 is about to open a year late, but it's coming. I have an invitation for next week to attend the opening of the Israeli pavilion, which I'm very much looking forward to. So that's going to be a big event. But we also want to reach out to other partners in the region. Certainly Bahrain is high on my list. I think they don't get nearly as much attention as the Emiratis do. They're generally not as high profile, but they're an important partner in this process. And I need to get there. And I've done some Zoom conferences with our team in AJC Washington, with one of the think tanks in Manama, but there's no substitute for getting there in person. And of course, my wife and son remain in Oman, in Muscat, Oman. I need to get back to Oman and continue my engagement with the Omanis. And we're also looking forward to the opportunity to visit Saudi Arabia in the near future. So that's a pretty good agenda to get started. As time allows, I would like to get to the core area and visit Egypt and Jordan and maybe Morocco, but that's out there somewhere after I'm well established in the Gulf.
Well, you definitely have a full agenda. And speaking of the Abraham Accords, September 15, 2021 marked the one-year anniversary of the signing of the Accords. In your opinion, Mark, what are the major elements of the Accords, and what impacts do you think that they have had in the year since they were signed?
Sure. So I think the most important aspect of the Accords is the sort of open-ended nature of the relationships, the wide open nature of the relationships that are developing. I'm sure everyone who follows, Israel's relations in the region knows that, peace with Egypt was signed in 1979. Peace with Jordan was signed in, I believe, 1984. 94, excuse me. But in both cases, those peace agreements were really from the top down, and were particularly on the side of the Egyptians and the Jordanians, deliberately meant to be a dialogue at the leadership level and at the intelligence and security level without really a people-to-people or a business and trade element. These agreements here, the Abraham Accords, are something totally different. They're wide open. There were multiple flights going back and forth every day. I think as Israel reopens from coronavirus and as the states in the Gulf reopen, those will resume. There's a tremendous amount of activity, both in terms of tourism, but also business visits and opportunities to cooperate and form business partnerships. There's a lot of Emirati investment in the Israeli economy as well. And there are lots of other elements that don't get as much attention, but which are very important, such as medical tourism. I think one of the backgrounds to the Accords is that for years, Israel actually made medical treatment at Israeli hospitals available to Gulf Arabs, but with an understanding that special arrangements could be made so that their entry into Israel and their presence there was not publicized, and they didn't have to go through, the regular channels through the airports and so forth. Over the years, that left a very, very positive impression. And so I think medical cooperation, medical research, medical technologies is another really important aspect of these accords. So this is a whole different kind of thing. And I remember my wife and I met with the Omani Minister of Oil. Actually, he's now Minister of Energy, but he was a Minister of Oil. Shortly after the accords were signed, and we both told him, look, there are lots of opportunities here for Oman as well, and you really should take a look at this. And he said, people that I know who know Jordan and Egypt say that peace with Israel hasn't had much of an economic impact. And I said, yeah, that's exactly the point. It hasn't, because the leaderships in those countries ensured that it didn't. It was by design. This is a different arrangement, and you really should take another look at it. Hopefully they will.
Good. Well, the Trump administration, as well as the leaders of the UAE and Bahrain, deserve credit for their courage and inspiration in looking beyond the established boundaries of political possibility and entering into the Accords. However, I think we all recognize that it has deep roots. And I would like to explore with you the role that the AJC has had in the development of the Accords. Could you elaborate on that?
So I would say the role isn't a direct one, it's an indirect one, but it's the culmination of all these years of engagement, of dialogue, of the many meetings that AJC leadership does in New York every year at the General Assembly. I heard from Jason Isaacson that they just saw the Egyptian foreign minister yesterday in New York. And I believe they met the Jordanian foreign minister and others, and the many leadership delegations that have come out to the region year after year. I think those things all had a cumulative impact. But that was only one of several different channels through which the Emiratis and then following them, the Bahrainis decided that this is something that was in their interests. And those include contacts with Israel that go back to the period after the Madrid conference in 1991, and the various multilateral working groups that were established that brought Israelis and Gulf Arabs directly into contact, discussing broader issues like refugees and water and arms control and those issues that were trade and investment that were discussed in multilateral working groups. There was a period in the 90s where Israel opened trade offices in a number of Gulf capitals. There was one in Doha, there was one in Muscat, and there was one in Dubai. Those effectively closed with the second Intifada in 2000, 2001. but the contacts actually continued surreptitiously. And there was a development, I think Israel's intelligence connections to the Gulf really probably go back to the Iranian Revolution or the period shortly after that. So all of these things sort of came together. But I think the role of, I'll give him great credit, and this is not meant to be a political statement, but I think Jared Kushner did a pretty amazing job in pulling all these parties together and sending out the message that there's more than one way to look at this problem, and taking a fresh look at some of the ways of dealing with the conflict in the region. So I would give him a lot of credit too.
Well, what is the attitude of the Biden administration toward the Accords?
So the administration is positive. I think to his credit, President Biden, when he was a candidate for president, when the Accords were originally signed, he very rarely had anything good to say about anything Donald Trump had done. But in this case, he did declare his support for the Accords. I think once the administration came into office, there was some reticence for whatever reason to use the term Abraham Accords, which I thought was unfortunate, but they seem to have gotten over that. And Secretary of State Blinken has referred to it as the Abraham Accords a number of times, and now President Biden has as well. So I think they're after some initial sorting out of, what do we really think about all this, they're behind it pretty solidly.
Well, President Biden recently announced that he has indefinitely suspended the Abraham Fund. What effect does that have on the Accords?
My sense is not very much. My understanding is the Abraham Fund was an idea that was sort of tossed around after the Accords were signed at the end of the Trump administration. There was actually somebody sort of put in charge of it, but as far as I know, there was no actual money appropriated. So it never really existed as a fund. It was a kind of a concept. And as I mentioned earlier, the business ties and the trade ties, certainly between Israel and the Emirates, don't really need the help of the United States. They're growing by leaps and bounds, all on their own, quite organically. Bahrain has a smaller and less open economy than the UAE, so it's not the trade ties aren't as developed, but there's progress there as well. I think if one thing a fund could do would perhaps be to see if there's some way to make this thing attractive to the Palestinians, and we'll get to that later. But I don't think the funding or not funding the fund really matters very much.
Well, to follow up on what you just said, a major criticism of the Abraham Accords is that it does not address directly the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Do you think that the Accords really offer the Palestinian benefits that are often overlooked by their critics?
Well, sure, I do think so. I think if it hasn't offered them opportunities, it's because the leadership of the Palestinian Authority has condemned the Accords and decided that not only that they don't officially want anything to do with it, but that no Palestinian private citizen or private businessman should have anything to do with it. I think that's a mistake. It's their mistake, because I think there are lots of opportunities, and I'm sure that Israel's business partners here in the Gulf would welcome the opportunity to invest in the Palestinian, certainly in the West Bank economy, but so far they're not really allowed to by the Palestinian Authority. We'll see. If there's a leadership change in Ramallah, that might be one of the things that comes on the agenda over time as they look at the opportunities that are presenting themselves. They may also come to change their minds, but so far they are adamantly opposed, and that's why it really hasn't offered them much, but the potential is certainly there.
Thank you. Let's move on to Iran. Iran continues to be troubling to most of the world. With respect to the 6 GCC countries, however, how do they view Iran?
It's important to remember that while the GCC was established in the early 1980s as kind of an effort to unite the Gulf states in the face of a very belligerent Iran, over time, each of the GCC countries has developed somewhat different relations or attitudes toward Iran. So there is no single Gulf attitude. The Omanis, who I know very well since I was ambassador there, believe they are the window for the Gulf to the Iranians. They've always maintained a relationship with Iran. They had actually the Shah of Iran was a military backer of Sultan Qaboos when he first came to power, and helped him defeat the insurgency in southern Oman that was backed by the South Yemen. And that relationship survived the Iranian Revolution. And the Omanis are proud of the fact that they maintain contacts with Iran. The Emiratis have their own set of issues because they have some islands that are historically part of the Emirates in the Persian Gulf, I guess not the Arabian Sea, that Iran occupied in the late 70s, I think, under the Shah, but the revolution continued it. The Emiratis want them back. The Iranians won't hear of it. Bahrain has a large Shia population, only part of which is Iranian in origin. But much of the Shia cleric community in Bahrain looks to Iran for leadership, and that puts them in conflict with the Sunni monarchy of Bahrain and creates frictions that come to the surface from time to time. Saudi Arabia has a longstanding ideological competition with Iran. Certainly since the Iranian Revolution. I think they had reasonably good relations during the Shah's period. And the Saudis, when you look at how Saudi Arabia flirted with Islamist extremism in the 1980s, many Saudis say that was a result of their trying to compete with Iran in the broader Islamic world. And I think they have learned over time that was a bad policy, and they're getting away from it. But the legacy of it is with us around the world. So they each have their own set of issues with Iran. None of them are comfortable really with Iranian power, but they each think in different ways about how to deal with it.
Well, thank you for that analysis. We can certainly see that AJC made a great decision to have you as their first director in the Abu Dhabi office, because you certainly know the area. What do you think the status, explain to us the status of the Biden administration's efforts to revive the JCPOA. Is that realistic? And if it's not, what do you think the U.S. strategy should be with respect to Iran?
Well, this is a campaign theme that President Biden, during the presidential campaign, made very clear that he intended to return the United States to the JCPOA. But I think they expected, once he took office, that the Iranians would be cooperative. And the fact is they weren't. They immediately announced that they would not meet face-to-face with American officials. These talks were set up in Vienna, in which the old parties to the JCPOA, so that's the French, the Germans, the British, the Russians, the Chinese, and the European Union, would all carry messages. I don't know how it was done. I guess they didn't all do it, but messages. They all met with the Iranians, and then they met with the Americans, but the Americans and the Iranians never met directly. And the Iranians stuck to their position that all of the sanctions that were put in place, some of them by Trump, but some of them go back to the Clinton administration, sanctions on Iran, had to be removed before they would be willing to sit down and negotiate about any limits on their nuclear program. So the whole thing really didn't go anywhere. And then they had their presidential election, and they elected a very hardline judge as their new president. In fact, the president of Iran doesn't really make Iran's national security policy. That's done by the supreme leader and his key advisors. But the president does set the tone of their foreign policy. And he's also insisted that Iran will not compromise on requiring an end to all sanctions before they will reimpose any limits on their nuclear program. So it's kind of stuck. The question is, what is Plan B? And I know that during Prime Minister Bennett's visit to Washington and his meeting with President Biden, at least for Bennett, this was the top priority issue. There is a working group, Israeli-American working group, led by the national security advisors of both countries to discuss, what is the alternative to the JCPOA if, in fact, it proves impossible to get the Iranians to agree to go back to it on anything other than their maximum terms. And it does, to me, appear that it's not likely to work unless the United States decides to give in totally and simply do what Iran wants. And I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, moving on to Israel, what are your thoughts on the new government of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett?
Well, I think it's kind of an experiment. I mean, Israeli politics have evolved from a system in which there was normally one party that had a large bloc. There's, I don't think, never been an Israeli election in which a single party had a majority, but there were usually parties that were big enough, that had a big enough bloc in the Knesset that they needed 3 or 4 coalition partners to form a government, and then they were good to go. But whatever party, whether it was Labor or Likud, that was at the center of this coalition, really set the tone for it. Over the years, the political system is kind of fractured. So you have more and more small parties, no party that really has, even a third of the Knesset seats. And so the coalitions become more complicated. Netanyahu, I think over the last 4 elections, they had 4 elections in 3 years, something like that. I've lost the exact timetable for it. But every time he won the largest bloc, but he not quite enough to form a coalition. And because he had made enemies with a number of his former partners in other right-wing parties or even parts of Likud, many of them, including Prime Minister Bennett, said they wouldn't serve with him again in a government. And so try as hard as he might, he couldn't form a majority. And so Bennett and Yair Lapid pulled together this very, very diverse coalition that goes from the fairly far left to the fairly far right. And for the first time, an Islamist, moderate Islamist Arab party as a partner in the coalition. So it's a very, very interesting experiment. I think political scientists will have a lot of fun with it. If it lasts, it has a lot of internal contradictions, so nobody's quite sure how long it will hold together. But so far, it's done better than a lot of people predicted. So it may be around for a while.
Well, how do you see the relationship between President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett developing?
It looked to me like they've done pretty well. There was a lot of bad blood between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Obama administration, certainly with President Obama, but also with Joe Biden as vice president, I think, and with Hillary Clinton, there had been a lot of not just disagreements, but sort of personal animosity that developed in that period. I think that carried over into the Biden administration. And so they were enormously relieved when Bennett became prime minister and they didn't have to deal with Netanyahu as prime minister. I don't think Bennett and Biden had much of a history of knowing each other, but they seem to have hit it off pretty well during Bennett's recent visit to Washington.
Well, before we move over to the audience questions, I'd like to ask one last question about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. In 2019, of course, we all know President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he merged the consulate in Jerusalem into the new embassy. In his meeting on August 27th, President Biden, in his meeting with Prime Minister Bennett, told him that he was going to reopen the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. What is the significance of that, Mark?
So the consulate in Jerusalem historically has been effectively the U.S. embassy to the Palestinians, or at least that's been the case since the Oslo agreements and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in the early 1990s. And even before that, the consulate largely focused on developing contacts with Palestinian notables and prominent families and politicians and so forth. It is a fairly unique situation, or it was until the Trump administration, in that the consulate, normally consulates are branches of the embassy. The embassy's in the capital city. The consulate, there's some countries have several consulates, but the consulates are in other large, usually urban centers, but they report through the embassy and they report to the ambassador. Until the Trump administration, that was not true of the consulate in Jerusalem. It reported independently to the State Department. And I'm a veteran of having served 4 years in Embassy Tel Aviv. The battles between Embassy Tel Aviv and Consulate General Jerusalem are historic and sometimes notorious in the State Department. And they can be quite personal too between ambassadors and consul general in Jerusalem because of their different perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think the Trump administration looked at this. The Trump administration actually initially had some fairly positive meetings with Palestinian Authority, with Mahmoud Abbas, but they got very frustrated with him as they started to fill out their peace plan. And it was pretty clear that he had no interest in what they were thinking about. And then when the president announced, or President Trump announced that he was recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Mahmoud Abbas cut off all contact except for security cooperation, because we still train the Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. He cut off all channels to the administration. So the administration was looking for ways to push back against the Palestinian Authority, and they found multiple ones. They ended the funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency that supports Palestinian refugees. They closed the PLO office in Washington, and they folded the consulate in Jerusalem into the embassy. So it became effectively a branch of the embassy that dealt with the Palestinians in theory, but by and large, after this, the Palestinians boycotted the Jerusalem branch. Now, for Israel, there's a real issue, though. We recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We have moved at least our ambassador's residence and pieces of our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, although I understand that parts of the old embassy in Tel Aviv are still there because we don't have the space yet to bring everybody over to Jerusalem. But you would effectively have two American diplomatic offices in Jerusalem with contacts with one with a recognized state and partner, the state of Israel, and another with a non-state actor that has pretensions to be a state, but isn't recognized by the United States as a state. And so the Israeli argument is if you want to have an office that deals with the Palestinians, that's fine. Put it in Ramallah, where their headquarters is, where the Palestinian Authority, where President Abbas sits, and that's fine with us. But don't reopen it in Jerusalem. I think that ultimately the U.S. will not agree to do that. Personally, I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's a bad idea. The security part of it would be very, very complicated, but we have embassies in lots of places that have dicey security situations, and we find ways to make them work. But I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to push very hard on reopening the old consulate in Jerusalem, but it will create frictions with Israel.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your insight. And now, Amy, I know you're going to have some great questions from the audience, so I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Red.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Clearly, we could spend hours with you. I mean, at the minimum. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Ray. I'm going to jump to Carl Lee's question. He asked specifically about relationships between Israel and Qatar. I'd like to expand a little bit on that, asking about what other Arab nations do you think, besides the four that normalized with Israel in 2020, do you see it, the future of Israel, building relationships with?
It's hard to say. I think the first round of normalizations kind of played its course. It moved very quickly from the Emirates to Bahrain to Sudan and Morocco. Sudan, because it's very unstable, has a kind of very fragile regime. It's not entirely clear if that's going to hold up, but at least the military part of the regime in Sudan, the new regime, wants to preserve it. Moroccans are very enthusiastic about it, and that's a real bright spot. And I think there's a lot still to come from that. I think, there was a lot of speculation at the end of the Trump administration, who's next. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's the right way to go. I think there's a lot of work to be done to develop the relationships that have just been established and to make them, effective and serious and productive. But, to me, I was very excited by this. I don't know if you heard about it. This meeting of 300 Iraqi notables in Iraqi Kurdistan in the city of Erbil in northern Iraq a couple of days ago, where they took the amazing step, I thought, of both acknowledging and apologizing for the expulsion of the Iraqi Jewish community in the early 1950s, which was about 150,000 Jews were expelled from Iraq and stripped of their property and their rights en masse, and most of the rest of the community gradually disappeared over the next 2 decades. So they actually apologized for that and said that that was the beginning of Iraq's descent into pretty miserable situation. That was one thing, and the other thing is they said that Iraq would benefit from joining the Abraham Accords. That's obviously not the policy of the Iraqi government. I don't see it happening in the near future, but I thought it was very, very interesting development and something that I'm hoping that I, in my capacity here, will be able to reach out to at least some of these people. And if there's some way that we can engage them directly, I would very much like to be part of that, because I had 2 postings in Baghdad after the fall of Saddam, and I know Iraqis well. I would be very interested in seeing what comes of that. Saudi Arabia clearly is the big elephant in the room, if you will, when you talk about the Gulf. And the Saudi issue, I think, has a lot to do with generational change. The generation of the king, of King Salman, and of his half-brother, Crown Prince, and then King Abdullah, when I was in Saudi, were very, very attached to the Palestinians as a kind of symbolic issue. It meant a great deal to them. It's pretty clear that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, doesn't feel that way and doesn't have that attachment. And you've seen some very interesting statements by, sort of former Saudi officials saying, look, the Palestinians had plenty of opportunities and they kind of blew it. And they shouldn't dictate to us, who we have relations with and who we don't. That's our business. So there's stuff going on there. It's just Saudi Arabia is a very big and complicated country, and much of what happens in the royal family is done in private rooms and behind the scenes, and you don't really know, until it comes out somehow. So that's the one to watch. I think that's the most interesting one.
Thank you.
So
Certainly interesting times. And I'm glad you did get a touch on to Matthew Ladden's question as well. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over.
I can come back to Twitter if you want me to. I don't know how many other questions you've got.
I'm going to pass it over to Joel to move on to the director's report. Thank you so much, Mark. And Joel, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So all we have standing between me and I assume your lunch or the or Sunday NFL is a brief director's report, and then our nominating committee chair Adam Lampert will make our new board members official. But I want to first of all thank Mark. Opening a new office is always incredibly exciting, but especially so with this one. When travel resumes, we are very much looking forward to an AJC delegation returning to your region. And I know that we are anticipating that several of the members of our Dallas AJC community will be a part of that delegation. And
that would be wonderful. Look forward to seeing anybody who comes here. That'd be great.
I know you've got several on this call that are planning on it.
Good, please come.
And of course, I want to thank Ray for serving so ably as our moderator. I'd like to begin my report with a word of congratulations, of course, to our new board members as well as to Stuart. We're really excited about what your additions mean for the future of AJC Dallas. I'd like to thank Harriet for being such a phenomenal partner under unprecedented circumstances over the last 15 months. Under the best of times, being a president presents its challenges. I value your partnership, energy, and passion in navigating AJC through these times. I'm also appreciative that given those challenges, you've agreed to extend your term by a year to ensure a smooth transition. So thank you so much for that, Harriet.
Is it possible to ask a question?
I'm sorry, if there's time afterwards, but if I can ask you to stay muted for now, and if we have time, we'll get into some more questions after the meeting. Thank you. For my brief report, I want to highlight just a few things that we're particularly proud of beyond what Harriet has already mentioned. First, I would like to mention our stellar assistant director, Amy Berger. She's just graduated as a member of the 2020-2021 class of MSC. This trailblazing civic leadership organization for emerging leaders counts some of the best and brightest in our community among its alumni. The relationships that she has cultivated through MSC have already helped expand AJC's local networks. She was also recently named to a working group through the American Council on Germany that will be looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in a transatlantic context. In this role, Amy is working alongside C-suite executives, State Department staffers, and prominent representatives of governmental and NGOs on both sides of the Atlantic to create a policy paper that will be unveiled in the spring. Too often, the Jewish community is left out of or de-emphasized in the DE&I conversation, and Amy's involvement is critical in ensuring that our community has a seat at the table and an opportunity to be heard. As Harriet mentioned, our coalitions have remained active, and through the DFW Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, we are one of a small number of regions piloting an upstander training called TACKLE. This initiative, which was underwritten by a grant from the Department of Homeland Security, will create and enhance local networks to proactively combat domestic terrorism and targeted violence. Participants come from the offices of elected officials, university administration, law enforcement, and others. Each training will be co-facilitated by trained experts from the Jewish and Muslim communities from AJC and from Muflahan, a Muslim organization that works to combat extremism and build community resiliency, and our partners in this work. Recently, when Ben & Jerry's announced its intent to cease doing business in the West Bank, AJC was contacted by a concerned franchisee from our local community. AJC has provided consultations and support to a number of franchisees who were dismayed by this decision, and a letter that was supported and consulted in consultation with AJC Chief Legal Officer Mark Stern was signed by franchisees who own 30 stores with a total annual revenue of nearly 25 million and a cumulative 250 years of partnership with Ben & Jerry's. AJC is continuing its work to ensure that states like Texas, with strong anti-BDS laws on the books, are examining their investments and exploring whether divestment from Unilever is warranted. And of course, everyone here is likely aware that just this past Friday, Texas placed Unilever on its list of companies engaged in a boycott of Israel. And in doing so, joined Arizona, Florida, and New Jersey in notifying Unilever that state investment funds will be divested from the company unless the decision is reversed. Finally, I would like to invite everyone here to attend our virtual event on October 11th, E Pluribus Unum, out of Mini One. This community of conscience event will feature many panels on advancing democracy with representatives from the George W. Bush Presidential Center and Freedom House, and one on coalition building with some of our interlocutors from the Muslim and Latino communities. The event will also include the presentation of the inaugural Community of Conscience Award for Bipartisanship to Congressman Colin Allred and Van Taylor. This virtual event is free and open to the public. Please email dallas@ajc.org in order to register. That is dallas@ajc.org. There are opportunities through sponsorships to join the host committee, and we do hope you will consider being one of the generous underwriters of this event. A reception with our honorees for those host committee members and their guests will be held in early 2022 as COVID numbers and the congressional calendar allow. We've tentatively scheduled it for the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day. It is now my pleasure to turn the meeting over to immediate past President Adam Lampert to deliver our nominating committee report.
Thank you, Joel. Madam President, fellow board members, friends, and guests. The nominating committee put forward the following names for the 2021 slate of new board members to a 2-year term: Christian A., Alan Gilbert, Catherine McGill, Michael Pollock, Helen Risch, and Kim Zoller. The committee also put forward Stuart Blaugrund's name in consideration for the position of president-elect for a 2-year term. Voting took place electronically, and the full slate of incoming board members, as well as the nomination of Stuart as president-elect, were overwhelmingly successful, and there are no plans for an audit. Thank you, Joel.
I don't know, this is Texas. I think that's how we play things here now. Adam, thank you for your leadership. I will, Emmanuel, I think you had a question. If Mark is still with us, and it looks like he is, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, you're muted still.
You hear me?
Yes.
I'm Emmanuel Abramovich. I'm calling you and listening to you from Paris. My father was working in the AJC in the 70s and the 80s. My question is, how can we be sure that the fantastic relationships who are created now are not only for the Arabic country an opportunity because they find an ally against Iran? How can you be sure that the partenariat and the relationships you are creating now gonna go through the years and are really sure without the diplomatic and war questions? Excuse me, I'm not very clear because
No, I understood your question.
Thank you.
I understood you well.
Thank you.
Fine. Things like this are never 100% sure. We don't know. But I think there's a very good chance that the kinds of relationships that are being built now will stand the test of time precisely because they're not, because the security and Iran portions of them are only perhaps now already secondary elements. It is the trade and investment and people-to-people contacts that are developing very, very rapidly that hold the promise of a kind of relations that could last, well into the future, aside from diplomatic questions and security questions. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in Iran? I'm still hopeful that awful regime could collapse of its own weight, and maybe nobody will see it coming until it's almost upon us. So I would hold out some hope for the possibility there could be some change on that score as well. But I really think it's the human contacts and the business development that's going to be the glue that holds this together. So that's my opinion.
Thank you for your answer.
With that, I would like to turn it over to Harriet to close us out. Oh, you're muted.
I want to thank all of you for spending part of your Sunday with us. And thank you so much for the wonderful program, and to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful day. We look forward to continuing all the work. Thank you.